Hi, everybody. How's it? No, no. Not yet, not yet. This could suck. OK. It won't. That's my title. Let's see if this works. Anyone? There we go. All right, so as Brandon mentioned, I was one of the founders of adaptivepath. Admittedly, there were quite a few of us. I like to think of myself as the best founder. This is one of the other ones. He was up here earlier today. I only have this slide in here because I try to put a picture of Peter in every presentation that I do. I think this picture is particularly good. And then I feel like I need to remind everyone that Peter is responsible for coining the term blog. This is not relevant to my presentation at all. It's just something I think he should be ashamed of. Regardless, Peter is now basically just a figurehead at the company. This is the guy who is actually in charge. And I have his picture here because when I sent my presentation to him before we got started and asked for his advice, he told me he thought I needed to make it more practical. I did not. In fact, I went the opposite direction. This presentation is very abstract. It does very little in the way of giving you practical advice or anything that will help you apply these theories to your organization, for the record. But I think you might like it anyway. As Brandon also mentioned, my current company is a company called Get Satisfaction. We do all sorts of things. Sometimes it's called open or social CRM. Sometimes we call it people-powered customer service. The basic idea is that you can leverage your customers to create social knowledge that can then be shared with other employees and other customers as well. So in a sense, sort of creating a dynamic or a social knowledge base, social CRM. The terminology is still unclear, which is, I guess, why it's a developing market. Here's an example of it working for Whole Foods. It's kind of cool. There's a lot of questions on here that people have about water. Actually, this is one of the things that Whole Foods found kind of fascinating. And I promise this is not a pitch for my company. It's just to the extent that this fits into my presentation. I'm going to get it out of the way now. So just kind of this fascinating discussion, and it helps companies figure out what it is that their customers care about. And now I'm going to stop talking about that, except to say that we have 36,000 companies, which I think is great. Here's some of them. And this idea, I think, is relevant to this idea of working like the network or starting to think about the way that network externalities can affect the organization or the internal structure of your business. Because when you look at something like customer service, what you see is we usually think about it working like this: product ideation, testing, launch, customer service, right? It's sort of this thing at the end. What you can do when you make it part of a social system, or you start to think about your customers as part of your business in some really concrete and explicit ways, is you see that the social effects of speaking with your customers, what we've traditionally called customer service, affects product ideation. It affects immersive testing. It affects launch. It can affect all of these things in ways that are really valuable. And I think that this is a really interesting phenomenon that's going on right now that businesses are only starting to grasp. So here's a framework in which we can think about this that's relative to this business. Experience design is an awesome field to work in because people who work in the field of experience design in any part of it generally love the customer, right? We're always spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to get them involved in the businesses that we work on, and in as many ways and as many forms, and sort of sharing that knowledge back as explicitly as possible. We are pretty much often the only part of the organization that cares about that, right? This is much more the way that most businesses think of themselves, and we'll come back to this metaphor quite a bit, as a castle with high walls that need to be protected from the outside. So let's talk a little bit about why that has happened. Well, first of all, we can look at sort of the structures that we use to support that, right? So how do businesses, let's call it, hate the customer, right? What are the ways in which we hate on customers? These are some of the tools that we've evolved, let's say, to do that, right? Outsourced call centers, FAQs, trouble ticket systems that treat people like numbers, not people. Why do we have these? It's not because we actually hate the customer. That's sort of an easy way that I think particularly I or other people working in the field sometimes want to use. It's actually because we have to do that in order to protect the mechanics and the efficiencies of our business. Or at least historically, that is what we've had to do. We've built these castle walls. We've created these structures because customers were a huge cost center and a huge productivity suck that had to be avoided. Right? So this is one of the challenges I found over the years after we gotten started with adaptivepath and trying to bring this in, looking at it not at an individual or a group level, but at a systemic level, trying to ask the question, why is it so difficult to bring customers and customer-related practices into an organization? And the answer is really simple. Every other part of the business sees that as a productivity killer. So we develop based on this, bad metrics and measurements, right, which is how most businesses value themselves. Metrics in the customer service field include things like time to call, which is to say how short can you make that conversation with every customer, right? This is what every other part of the business is measuring its value based on, right? It's very obvious in customer service, but we see it all over. Of course, bad metrics and measurements that are about things like, how quickly can I get rid of this customer lead to this. Right? I mean, it's a pretty clear outcome from one to the other. We create a set of incentives that is about avoiding customers, and then we cannot be surprised when the customers express some frustration around the fact that we are avoiding them. So then, this is always a really interesting photo for me to consider in light of the photo that I'm about to show you, which is this one. Come on, little machine. There we go. And yes, I did spend some time on the color balance. So the thing that I find really interesting about this is that this is most people's experience. When it comes to phone systems or just communication technologies in general, right? We have opened up, I mean, I think a new channel opens up every day for communication online, right? We've created this amazing platform that is just about opening up and incenting people to find new ways to connect and communicate. And we're doing that with each other, and yet this is still pretty much the model that we have when it comes to companies. Right, so this is interesting, and it's an imbalance, and I think it's one that we need to seek to address, which is where this presentation comes from. So friction-free communication is what we want to figure out how to bring into our businesses. So here's the basic premise of working like the network. A business cannot succeed in a networked environment by trying to take a traditional model that is not networked and apply it to that. In fact, what has to happen is that businesses, the organizational structures, the incentive systems, the cultural ways that we communicate, all need to change relative to the way that networks work, because that is the only way that you can actually thrive on the network. And I also try and sneak not just a picture of Peter, but also a Tron image in every presentation I do. There's always something you can apply Tron to in the world of technology. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. So first of all, networks, not a new concept, right? I mean, we have this really fantastic one that we've been working on for the last, at least in a really sort of public, open, cultural way, the last 20 years. But networks themselves are nothing new, right? This is one of the original networks that we really built the basis for much of what we do in business on, the railroad network. Right, so what we did with that is it was about moving goods, right? This was really the beginning of business process and business efficiency that for this country that's really, and other countries, but that has really started to lead to the level of scale and efficiency that we see these days, right? So what did we do in this environment? We created hierarchies. We had to create hierarchies because we had to manage the flow of information, and we had to manage the flow of information and the way that individuals interacted, right? So this is a model that comes from the military world, and then we apply it to business so that we can do things like move goods around. And why do we apply that? Why do we have that level of rigor and efficiency? Because if we don't, this happens, right? When we try and achieve scale, when we are moving huge goods around on trains, we have crashes if we don't do this. And I think that's really interesting because that is the mindset that we still bring into the way that we do organizational structures these days. And that's kind of fascinating because the world has really changed, right? Most of the time, most of our businesses are not doing that, right? Most of the time, our businesses are not trying to move around large commercial goods. We don't have to worry about train crashes. We have this interesting thing now where the economics of information have been inverted. We don't have train crashes, we have server crashes, right? And server crashes are a lot less deadly, for the most part, a couple of notable exceptions, than train crashes. And I think this is really interesting because when I say that the economics of information have been inverted, what I really mean is failure used to mean the train goes off the tracks. But failure now means something very different, right? In many cases, failure is costless. In fact, in some cases, failure can actually be kind of valuable because it's one of the ways that we innovate, it's one of the ways that we iterate, it's one of the ways that we sort of push the conversation forward is through many, many, many small failures at the level of the server as opposed to one huge failure at the level of the train. How am I doing here? Is everybody following me? Have I gone too far into the abstract world? I love this audience. That's great. Okay. Feel free to, if at any point I wander off into, just pull me back in. Shout out a question. I'd appreciate it. So this is really interesting to me because we have one model that was created to serve one set of purposes, and now we have an environment and a new kind of model that we have to figure out how to bring in relative to that old model. Right, so the question that I have and the thing that we're going to be talking about and the place for which I have no really practical answers yet is what are the ways in which we start to do that? What are the ways in which we can start to pull in this kind of costless thinking, this sort of failure as value as opposed to failure as death, approach into our environment, into our organization, because I think that's where we really start to see some huge benefits. So the other thing I want to say about this is it also means that it's not just about sort of failure and our ability to embrace it, our ability to make failing costless, or really, I guess you could say, our attempt to try many different things costless. It's also about creating a more porous relationship with the outside world. So if traditionally the model has been we are a castle wall, because that's, again, the only way we can manage things at scale, now we have these really interesting opportunities to create different kinds of values, to invert the kind of value that we have. So when I say linking creates new kinds of value chains, what I basically mean is that because we can so easily connect, and we all do this as individuals, and we're only starting to figure out how to do it as groups or organizations, we need to find ways, better ways, to connect to everything that's going on outside of the castle wall. So the castle wall, which was for however many years a strength and a way that our company grew, is now for many organizations actually an impediment. Impediment to new kinds of learning, impediments to new kinds of information, impediments to new ways of doing things, new processes, new kinds of approaches. Right? Because all of that exists outside of our business, because necessarily there is more going on outside of our business than there can ever be going on inside of it. And yet again, our structures internally are designed to, right? I mean, think about all the layers that are just between you and the customer, or between most of the departments and the customers inside your organization. I mean, if you've been in the field of user experience, you've been dealing with that forever. Now take that and apply it to every other part of the business, right? And at a scale that's much more significant. So this idea of linking, creating new kinds of value chains, and this recognition that there is more value externally than there is internally is a really interesting new idea, and one I find that's very challenging for most businesses, because a lot of businesses operating in this environment think about how they can control information and the amount of information that they're taking in. Right? That's one of the ways that they create structure and hierarchy. The problem with that, of course, is that these days, if you have this feeling that things are moving too quickly for you and spinning somewhat out of control, that's a pretty good thing. That just means you're paying enough attention. So again, there's an interesting tension there, right? So this idea that value exists externally and that it's something beyond. Here's another way to say the same thing, right? I mean, super basic. Google, Facebook, and Twitter, all of these things are incredibly valuable to every single business on the planet. Right? And as a business, you've either figured this out and started to embrace it, or you will figure it out and will figure out how to embrace it. So here is a very sort of practical example of that, although I think that this is only the tip of the iceberg, because this is, again, just sort of happening at a scale that these businesses can notice. And there's a lot underneath this that these businesses haven't even necessarily gotten to. So here is the question that I have that I keep restating in different ways. How do we go as a business from this to this? It's a sponge, right? It's not that it's not that it's not coherent. It's not that it's not cohesive. It's not that it doesn't still hold together. It's just that the walls are a little more porous. It allows things in and it allows things out, and that is built into the structure of the organization itself. So, practically speaking, since that was what Brandon asked me for, what does this mean? I think it means three things. One, we're at a phase in the development, and I think this is fantastic for people who work in the field of experience design generally. Just as an aside, as a direction that the market is going, the level of awareness inside all organizations at all levels right now about their customers has never been higher, right? Which is pretty fantastic if you work in a part of the organization that is really about understanding and bringing learning from the customer inside. And it's not just the parts of the organization that we have traditionally worked with. I think every part of the organization now is aware of the customer in a way that it wasn't previously, and the impact that that can have on their piece of the business. Now, they are aware of the impact. They are not necessarily aware of how to do that. And I want to be really explicit about this line. When I say most organizations have no idea what to do about that, I don't mean they don't know how to get a Facebook fan page. What I mean is they do not understand yet how to systemically bring that knowledge, systemically and repeatably bring that knowledge into their organization. Right? So that can mean a lot of different things. It means they don't understand how it works from a technological infrastructure piece, right? It may mean that they don't, like, because they've got this 25-year-old ERP system that it's got to connect to, and they don't know how to do that. Or it means they just literally don't understand how the organizational structure needs to change, or what the new job types or the roles or responsibilities are that are required in order to make that happen. So these are all open questions, and I think open questions are awesome and fun, because that's when you can actually affect real change. So here are 6 ways that I see organizations changing relative to this, and I'd love your thoughts on them. The first is this idea of going, and a lot of these were referenced earlier, from control to cacophony. right? So here's this idea that you as a business, no matter how large you are just a node on the network, right? Even Google, big a business as it is still just one node and a network that is, regardless of the size of Google, still way the hell bigger than Google is, right? So this is a fantastic concept, and it's great, and it puts us in our place, and wow, isn't the universe a large and marvelous thing, and I'm a tiny speck inside of it. So that's cool, and it's really interesting that we've now built that structure into the way that businesses can work and recognizing that kind of understanding. So that means any number of things, right? I mean, I don't know how many customers still care about their homepage. I don't, because this is my homepage, right? This is the homepage for almost every business on the planet, possible exception of Facebook, and even that will change eventually. Right? Then we have this other thing happening that we're starting to see in, I think, a really blunt way with sites like Yelp, right, which is businesses recognizing that customers lead the conversation. This isn't necessarily new, I think, to us, but I find that the stories that you hear about businesses trying to deal with something like the fact that Yelp and the customers on Yelp now drive a significant percentage of their business or can drive a significant percentage of their business away. The stories, the individual stories about how they deal with that, really fascinating because it's representative of this change. This other recognition, which is that because of our hierarchical structure, because we basically use process as a way to instrument and slow things down, there's this really interesting thing happening now with new channels of communication open up every single day. And that means that change is necessarily happening faster than organizations can process, which I think is great personally, because it makes the world more fun and interesting. But at an organizational level, it can be quite challenging. That said, here's a great quote from a book by William White, who I like a lot. He wrote The Organization Man. Anybody ever read The Organization Man? Classic 50s study of basically old white guys in suits. Basically in the 50s. It was like the classic argument. And so I love that the second book that he wrote, or second or third, was called The City, and it was a study that he did. This is totally fascinating. A study that he did of watching people walk around Manhattan and then actually paying attention at the most minute level to how we operate when we're moving quickly in highly mobile, highly sort of networked environments. Paid attention to eye gestures and the way that you actually work as a human being to manage in those situations, the sort of tools and techniques that you use. So the reason that I get excited about something like this is because we'll figure it out, right? And the act of figuring it out, I think, opens up really interesting opportunities. One of the things he learned actually was that when we're moving quickly in large crowds, most people, depends on which hand you use, but most people focus on the upper left shoulder of the person in front of them. And you probably don't notice that you do this, but that's how you navigate in large crowds. You sort of peg yourself to someone else and use that as a guide, for the record. Try it sometime. And then of course we have this idea of iteration, right? Iteration really just being the flip side of failure. A nice way to say it. The second way, I'm zooming along because they only gave me 30 minutes, but there's so much that I wanted to tell you. The second way is from process to flow. And this isn't going to be, I think, anything new to those of us who are working in the experience industry, right? But here we go again with this unbelievably ugly hierarchy, VP Finance of Info. And just looking for opportunities to bring some improvisation into that, to look for places or times or opportunities where we can change. How many of you guys work with or are familiar with agile development processes? Right, oh, wow, that's awesome. So as a sort of a sign of where the culture is going, my favorite lesson from the agile development process is that part of the process is changing the process, which is just a brilliant phrase. It's also the thing that most agile teams forget right away. But it's really a brilliant phrase, right? Because it says you should always be on guard for the places at which inflection points happen, the points at which we need to introduce something new. And I think that's very much tied to this. And those of you who are familiar with, is it Lisa or Liza? I can never remember. Liza, Reichelt?
Whichever you like.
Yeah, okay, so let's say Lisa. This concept of the waterfall to the washing machine as a way of thinking about design practices and development practices, right? So just the idea that we're going from this to this to this to sort of constant spinning motion. Again, it's a little discombobulating, it's a little disconcerting, it's ultimately a lot more effective. And again, I sort of want to stress this idea that that feeling that we get sometimes where we feel like things are out of control might actually be a really fantastic sign that things are operating at the right speed, just as a way of starting to break from some of these frames. The third one, from documentation to collaboration. So I love Actually, I don't really love documentation. Everybody who ever worked within adaptivepath hated me for this, particularly Jesse James Garrett, who's built his career on top of brilliant documentation techniques. So I don't like documentation. I think the problem with documentation most of the time is not that it can't be a fantastic working tool, but that for most people or for most organizations, documentation is just a record of failed collaboration. That's the problem I have with it most of the time. We use it as an excuse. So we end up with folders that look like this. Thanks, Flickr. Right? But when you think about the way that we don't work like that. We work like this, right? Or if you're me, you work like this. I think this is the original napkin for get satisfaction. And I have no idea what it means, but it was clearly helpful in the moment. Right? Or we work like this, right? And this is, this is not a great representation of agile development practices, but that's just sort of a way of stratifying something that a lot of us do most of the time anyway, which is sit and work in tandem. And then, of course, there's this, right? Which I think this year, 2010 in particular, we're starting to see just a blowout on the ways that mobile is starting to affect the way that we can work organizationally. So here's an example from Get Satisfaction that I love, just the only example I'm going to give you from the company, actually, on the practical tip. This was from Timbuktu. It was the first time I really sort of recognized it's awesome when you build something and you see it work for the first time. This was it for me. This was one of Timbuktu's customers that asked, do you make a diaper bag? And the answer at the time was, no, we do not make a diaper bag. Timbuktu was 10 years old at the point this came out a couple years ago. And Timbuktu was 10 years old, and they had started as a sort of a hipster bike messenger company. They make bike bags. They make all sorts of bags. Basically, they're located here in San Francisco, in case you're not familiar. And what was so interesting to me about this is that the response, if you look at this thread, still going strong on Get Satisfaction. If you look at it, their initial response is, no, we don't make diaper bags. Why would we make diaper bags? We're a bike messenger company. That's sort of who we are. It's core to our thinking, right? So this is how we work inside organizations, right? We say, this is core to our thinking. These are our internal structures. This is what we believe, right? That's how we work. But what happens when you sort of bring in this ongoing conversation with the customer is one of the customers pops in and says, you know what, guys, I totally get that. I understand that you're a bike messenger company. I know that because when I started out as a bike messenger 10 years ago in my mid-20s, I bought your bags constantly, and they were fantastic, and it was revolutionary. He's like, but here's the deal. I am not in my mid-20s anymore. I am in my mid-30s. I still love your bags, and I have a child, right? So it was this very interesting moment for Timbuktu where the sort of presence of their customers in that way changed the way that they were able to articulate their value, helped them recognize that external functions were moving faster than they had been able to internally. So I think a very concrete representation of this whole concept. They make a diaper bag now, by the way. In fact, the other thing that's really cool, based on this topic, and the other thing that's really cool about it is that there's like 3 or 4 people who are like, you know what, Timbuktu doesn't make a diaper bag, but I hacked a diaper bag together, and I'm going to give you very explicit step-by-step photo instructions, which they actually used when they were building the bag. Cool stuff like that. And then here is a great chart that somebody showed me, these guys, Jonathan Bonnell and Jason Theodore. It's just this idea of manufacturer-consumer conversions. I'll have this thing up on SlideShare, so you can download this later, or you can check it out on their site, which I inconveniently did not actually put on this slide. But just this idea that as the sort of the time to converse has gotten closer, there's a different way of thinking about the relationship. You can tell it was made 6 months ago because they put Google Wave under real time, and I think we've already forgotten about that. Fourth, prevention to recovery. So why? I mean, we have so many reasons for creating the castle wall. I went and switched up with a different castle here. But certainly fear of competition is one that comes up often, certainly as an excuse for not getting involved or invested in a lot of this kind of thinking. It's also a ridiculous argument because it doesn't really matter. It's like sticking your horrible. Anyway, sticking your it's like trying to be an ostrich and sticking your head in the sand. I mean, the conversation is going to continue going on whether the company chooses to participate or not, right? So it doesn't really matter whether you want to do this or not. There's no such thing as secrecy in this sense anymore. Here's a great example early on. This guy, Justin Deal, who was a whistleblower at Kaiser Permanente. It was the first time I'd ever seen anybody sort of do do like a Watergate thing. But with such ease, right? Because all he needed was a scanner, and he just emailed out some PDFs, right? It was so much less work for him to blow the whistle on Kaiser Permanente, and I thought, wow, that's fantastic. Whistleblowing is even that easy these days. Not that it doesn't still have cultural implications. So then we start to see companies embracing these channels as a way. I think smart companies embrace this, right? So here we have David Neeleman, the CEO of JetBlue Airways, actually using YouTube as a way to apologize for keeping a bunch of his passengers on the runway. This was 2 or 3 years ago. It's just the first time I'd seen anybody embrace an external channel at that level inside an organization. So I thought it was fantastic, going where your customers are and then talking to them the way that they want to be spoken to. Really fantastically interesting. And then this is from a Harvard Business Review article about Pixar, which is just like a brilliant company in terms of thinking about commercial production. I'd highly recommend that you read it. I love this line. Management's job is not to prevent risk, but to build the capability to recover when failures occur. So that's a fantastically interesting way to start thinking about this at a structural level. And then I love the next line too, where he says it must be safe to tell the truth. I think that's really dangerous and difficult for a lot of companies. So I think we should all be headed in that direction. Next up, walls to windows. So we have this idea that secrecy is obsolete inside businesses for all the reasons we just went over. I think it's also worth noting that inside that environment, it can be very difficult to understand when you start to think about a network environment or multiple touch points outside of the organization. It can be challenging to figure out where your interests end and others begin, right? And I mean this at a very practical level, right? Like, which is that this thing, right? So when something goes wrong on this phone, like, I don't know whose fault it is, right? There's at least, for most of the things that I do with this phone, there's at least 3 different companies involved, right? The company that built the application, the company that's providing the network, and the company that provided the actual physical device, right? And if you start to think about the way that we work, it's not just the iPhone, which is an easy and convenient example because I had it sitting right next to me. It's most of what we work on, right? Anytime we work on a web property, there's at least 3, as an example, there's at least usually 3 or 4 different sort of technologies or companies or organizations in the mix. And so again, we have to start rethinking about our organization in a way that's structural to accommodate this. In the world that we live in, that just means we've kind of started building, and smart organizations start to think about, like, what are all of the different edges that I could put on my business, right? So here's Widgetbox, which is a company that's basically sort of a widget factory, right, for businesses that work on the web. And it's just sort of a platform for doing that and for recognizing that a lot of these businesses just need to put themselves in so many different places. This is a really explicit representation of this. You see it with all of the different ways that companies, even ones that are going to go out of business soon, like Yahoo. Anybody from Yahoo here? No, good. Okay. They probably can't afford to send anybody to conferences. So, sorry. They're out as a sponsor. So, but just starting to think about all of the different ways that you can open your business out, right? Like with widgets, so that you can put it everywhere on the web, but also this idea, this is a gallery example. I could have used a WordPress gallery example, or all of these other ways, or even Facebook with our application platform, all of these other ways that companies are starting to allow the outside in, not just the inside out. Right? And then you see really cool stuff like Best Buy a couple years ago launched an API. I don't even know if anybody knows what this is good for yet. I don't know that anybody's using it. But just the idea of it is fascinating, and the degree to which you see organizations experimenting with this idea of putting edges out into the world to see what happens. I think that's awesome. And then, of course, we got this idea of edges in terms of Facebook and Facebook pages and all of these different places where your business can now be represented where your customers are. So all of this is it's just edges. It's just experimentation. It's just who knows where it will stop or if it will ever stop. But being a business means being able to operate at a speed that can take into account all of these changes, all of these edges, all of these places where the customers are and what they want, taking that into account and figuring out how to bring that back into the business in a way that's valuable or meaningful. And I think, by the way, that the phrase valuable and meaningful is the place where there's still a lot of work to be done, which is great for this crowd. And then the last one, my personal favorite, because I live in Northern California, which is full of hippies, from ownership to stewardship. So I think this is a fascinating development that has started to show itself in all sorts of really interesting and valuable ways in the way that organizations work. Because for the most part, most organizations tend to be a little inhuman, right? Despite recent Supreme Court rulings, the way that most organizations operate is in a way that's very different from the way that you or I would operate interpersonally, right? There's a level of sort of care, compassion, humanity, interconnection that does not exist once we sort of bump up to the level of an organization, except we're starting to see a really interesting environment emerge where that level of sort of humanity or interaction inside our systems is actually becoming valuable to organizations, right, is actually translating in some cases into things that reflect upon their bottom line. And that's great, I think, for anyone who works in a profession that is dedicated to customer experiences, to user experiences, to good design, to anything that is about giving people, putting something in the world that is valuable or meaningful to someone. So ownership to stewardship, here's one of my personal heroes. Started the Sierra Club, John Muir. He has this great quote. He's responsible for, well, really, he's responsible for pretty much every major park in California and the way that we think about parks and the preservation of land and the sort of community aspects of it that surround it. Like, he's the guy for all of that. He's awesome. And this quote I love: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So this was true 100 years ago. It's just as true now. It's just that now we're starting to recognize how to bring that into the systems that we operate in. Here's a quote from Ted Reingold about a site that he runs, quote unquote runs, Dogster. About week 3, I realized I wasn't in charge anymore. Apparently the puppies are now in charge, which is cool. I just think it's a lot of humility in that quote, which I think is terrific. It's what he built his business on top of. And I think a lot of businesses need to start thinking about how to bring that level of awareness, compassion, and humility into their work. I have a friend, Mark Hedlund, who once told me that he thinks businesses operate best when they align the grains. And so if you're familiar with the concept of woodworking, in woodworking you actually can't glue end grain to end grain. You have to make sure that the grains in the wood run the same way so that there's enough surface area for them to actually match up so that they can actually connect to each other, which I think is really fantastic because it's sort of operating at a micro and a macro level all at once. And this idea of aligning the grains is saying, are we all moving in the same direction and for the same reason? Right? What did Google do that revolutionized advertising? They said most advertising takes people away from whatever it is they're trying to do. What if we made advertising help people do what it was they were trying to do, right? And then they built a multi-billion-dollar business on top of that, but probably prints more money than the US Mint. So I think that there is explosive value to be realized right now in this environment around this concept of aligning the grains. And then the other thing I'll point out about that is, even though they struggle with it at times, even the fact that Google sort of put this out as one of their operating principles and that it is still used in ways to guide the conversation, even when they do actually end up being evil by, whatever measure you want to use for evil, the fact that this is the starting point for the conversation, that is a really new and wonderful thing, and I think other businesses should find ways to try and emulate it. So then, again, on the practical side, I think you could be asking, in terms of your organization, what does this mean? Go department by department and do a thought experiment. What does it mean for customer service? I mean, that's what we're working on. What does it mean for marketing and brand development? There's all sorts of things you can do with the people outside your organization. Product development, we're all really familiar with this. What are ways we can make testing more iterative, more collaborative, more constant, expose it to more and more people inside the organization? Business development, when it comes to working together. Advertising, when it comes to thinking about advertising as a two-way as opposed to a one-way platform, which I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of this year. And even human resources, right? I mean, you'd not believe the number of people that have hired employees based on their activity and get satisfaction, right? It's really fantastically interesting to me to see, once you open up to your customers, the range of things that are possible because of it. So in summary, because I think I'm about out of time, we started with this, now we have this. Most companies look like this. We want them to look like this. That means that these things are happening. We want the world to look like this. It's going to affect all of these different places. Thank you.